know by now I'm in Manchester at the minute, and regular programmes such as Woman's Hour, You and Yours and Front Row are now regularly broadcast from up north. But would the audience be happier if more of its media messages, radio and TV, came out of its own region? And sex on the wireless after midnight. There's a new breed of late-night schlock jock. Do they provide a public service phone-in or just a prurient thrill for the insomniac eavesdropper? Well, Britain's media is dominated by London. There is a general perception that if you're happy to spend your entire working life in Manchester, Bristol, Birmingham, Glasgow or Leeds, well, frankly, you lack the ambition to really make it to the top. But does radio and television that fails to acknowledge that there is life, culture and talent north of Watford Gap do its audience a disservice? Should there perhaps be a national television station in a regional city better to reflect the interests of non-metropolitan Britain? Well, Rob Brown is a senior lecturer in journalism at the University of Westminster, something of a traitor, as he used to lecture at Salford. Alice Morrison is Chief Executive at North West Vision, and Stuart Cosgrove is Channel 4's Director of Nations and Regions and joins us from Glasgow. Now, Stuart, this is something that you have spoken about in public this week, that there is a need for a regionally based TV network. Why do you think we need one?
I think the most obvious reason, Jenny, is that there's far too much concentration of network production power within London. I think that's a given that most people in the industry accept. I think that when you were talking about it earlier, I think you were conflating two separate things, one of which is the regional representation of particular regions, two regions, and I think we've actually got a very, very good service for that across the UK in different areas of the nations and regions of Britain. What I'm specifically talking about is the presence of a national network outside of London in one of the key regional cities to better improve that city's creative industries development. I mean, so for example, there would be no significant reason as to why you couldn't relocate BBC Two to, say, Manchester. The UK government has already relocated the Royal Mint in Cardiff, the Vehicle Licensing Authorities in Swansea, the Centre One Tax in East Kilbride. I mean, there's all sorts of examples of it in other industries. Why not broadcasting?
Now, Rob, I suspect some time ago you would have supported Stuart in this argument.
Yeah, I would have supported him as a Scot if it was relocated to Scotland, but I wouldn't if it went anywhere else in England, get terribly excited. And this is the problem Stuart has. Which channel is he saying? Well, he said BBC Two, and which city? Now, is he telling me that the whole of the regions will rejoice if Manchester gets this station? I mean, they're going to be dancing in the streets of Glasgow, Liverpool, Leeds or Hull or anywhere else because Manchester has it. And it's interesting that Stuart goes for Manchester because it's the only obvious other city. And it's not going to change the regional distribution of employment in the UK.
Is it going to turn out, if this were to happen, Alice, as cities arguing about who's got Harvey Nicks or not?
I think there's a point in there, but the truth is, if it was relocated in Manchester, which would be a fantastic idea, obviously,
because you happen to be based here,
but it would also service the whole north. And I think there is an argument for having a twin axis of power.
Well, actually, what the key beneficiaries of such a move, if Stuart forced BBC Two up to Manchester, the key beneficiaries would be British Airways and British Midland, because what would happen, as we all know, is that all these smart creative people who want to live in Hampstead or Islington or whatever would just shuttle up and then come back down. It already happens, as Jenny knows and lots of other people know,
yes, but
with the regional.
Here.
But you, Jenny, you are a Macclesfield chauvinist, and you know you are quite unusual in that respect.
I think the point is as well, though, there's two ways to look at this. One, it would be brilliant to bring up the centre of power to one of the regional cities, and I would actually welcome it wherever it went, in truth. But yes, we would all be batting for our own city. That is also true. But there's another way to look at it. I'm interested in a model whereby we empower the producers rather than continuing to have all the power vested in the commissioners. And what I'd like to see is the industry growing underneath, so that actually what we're saying is, London, you need us because we make all the best productions.
Well, but hang on a minute. Let me bring Stuart in here, because the only thing that really matters in this, Stuart, is what difference does it make to the audience? Does the audience get a better service? So why do you think it would make a difference to the viewer?
Well, you say that that's the only thing that matters. I think that's the principal thing that matters. It's not the only thing that matters. And also Alice's point that it's merely a matter of production. I'm not sure I agree with that either. It's quite interesting that just this week a very eminent statistician and auditor of the screen industries, the David Graham Associates, have audited this development of the Scottish screen industries over the last few years, and it shows quite a significant, about a 12% growth in production in Scotland over the last last few years, but nil growth, zero growth in key broadcast management functions, scheduling, planning, compliance, a whole range of middle to upper management jobs, which are high-value jobs, which simply aren't happening outside of London. And so I think it's not just about production, it's actually about the whole functions of modern broadcasting.
Jenny, you described me earlier as a bit of a traitor leaving Salford. Actually, a commute between Cheshire and London, but I'm a traitor to some extent in the sense that I used to be in a committee that argued for this decentralisation endlessly. And I got really tired with it and bored with it because it struck me that what it was whinging, not winning. I'm all for people bringing work and developing the regions. People like Nicola Schindler here in Manchester, who earned her spurs in London and then came back, created Red Productions, which has made Queer as Folk, Clocking Off, all those sort of stuff. Similarly, Kirsty Wark up in Glasgow, who's done the same, a wonderful production company her and her husband run. These are winners, they're not whingers. And Stuart, that's what Stuart should be spending his time, is encouraging winners. Let's get away from this tiresome moaning in the regions.
Alice, it is true. Hang on, Stuart, I'll come back to you in a minute. But Alice, it is true that great drama has come out of, I have to say, this city that we're in at the moment, without there being a station here.
That's absolutely true. But I think, again, let's look at it both ways. You said, does the audience benefit? And yes, the audience is already benefiting because we've got so many voices from the regions and from the nations, for that matter. But, I'm with Stuart. I'm with Stuart, actually. It would be great to have a centre of power up here because power is important. We've got devolution of power now increasingly used throughout Britain. I think that is a very important point. And also, let's not forget that, for example, and I will give the example, the BBC... 12% of licensing fee payers live in London. 12%, 72% of the BBC spend is spent in London.
But why?
Okay, but hang on. But what real difference do you think it will make to the audience? Obviously, make a difference to jobs for the girls and boys in the northwest or wherever you happen to place it.
Is that not an important point, Jenny?
No, it is an important point. Yeah. But I'm thinking in terms, as our programme is called, The Message, of what. Yep. Message does it give out to the audience if you make this change?
Maybe there's another way of phrasing that question. Would there be a perception disadvantage to the audience, given that, for example, major dramas, as we just said, Clocking Off, Queer as Folk, Coronation Street, the biggest soap opera, are not made in London? So I think the argument about what the audience benefits, you could ask it another way, saying, let's say that there was no audience disadvantage, it would still be a good thing in terms of sector development for those cities. And I actually, don't see this as a whinge at all. It's actually to do with a kind of an inerring logic. I spend almost every day of my working week encouraging creative production outside of London. I don't do it whinging. Rob's moved from every city in Britain. I hope he doesn't move to Tasmania, because God only knows what he'll think when he moves there. And there is a way where we have to look beyond Britain and look at other countries.
Well,
where
exactly.
The model's different.
Exactly, Stuart. And this is why why are we focusing on what London's got and we haven't, rather than saying television and the cultural industries generally are being internationalised, as you know. Why aren't you out winning contracts from some of the big international commissioners instead of sitting huddling in Scotland moaning about the fact that you've not got enough work?
See, the thing, I'm not moaning about sitting in Scotland. I represent Channel 4's production across the UK, not Scotland. And furthermore, I think it's important to bear in mind that some of the BBC's biggest global brands, Teletubbies being an example of that, is actually made in the West Midlands. So I don't think there's any sense that people aren't actively going out and seeking major global brands. In fact, one of Channel 4's biggest successes that you've just mentioned, Queer as Folk, is actually sold to Paramount as a format from Manchester. So that's happening all the time. What I'm arguing about is the middle management jobs around programme management. So if, for example, you looked at the USA, there's a really, really interesting thing has happened in the USA. If you look at it, of course, there's a concentration of power in the media in Los Angeles for the film industry and New York for advertising and some television. But Atlanta in Georgia has CNN. The PBS systems have a power base in Boston. Discovery Channel is based in Bethesda, Maryland. There's a major cluster of different Latino stations in Florida. Some of the next generation media stations, Microsoft TV, are based in Seattle. And Yahoo Broadcast.com is based in Dallas. There's a whole range of different stations, network and interactive.
You've done well to pick out a couple of exceptions there. And as you know,
that was about 8 exceptions.
Well, we're talking about an entire continent.
But I think you'll find, Rob, that a couple means two. I gave you 8 there.
Right, well, 8 out of a continent of 250 million people. You know that critical creative...
Hang on, let him get a word in, Stuart.
Creative talent tends to congregate. You tend to get critical masses. That's been the case since classical Rome and Greece. Creative people want to be there. And what I'm saying is, if you forced BBC Two, which is what you were suggesting earlier, to be run from, I think it was Manchester you picked, but why nowhere else? Pick Manchester. You know what will happen. They're not going to be forced to go to Manchester. Most of them will just shuttle up.
Alice?
And let you decide to live in Glasgow because that's where you want to live.
Alice?
The thing about this is, isn't it? It's true. Creative people do like to cluster together, and that's why it's absolutely essential, actually, that we have proper regionalisation so that the cluster isn't all in one place, because that would be mad.
No, it'll be in 2 places if Stuart gets this way.
Well, thank you, Stuart, for promoting Manchester. Very pleased with that. But what I'd also like to say here is that I think there's a big market force here. And if I was Dawn Airy at Sky now, I'd be looking, because she's committed to doing some actual in-house production for Sky, and that's a new direction for them. And they are cost-cutting. You know, they want the cheapest product. And what I would say is, look to the regions for cheap product. We've got better salary rates, we've got the talent, we've got the technical talent, more BAFTA winners here than any other region.
Well, that's why QVC, of course, the shopping channel, is based in Merseyside. They can flog those trinkets from absolutely anywhere. But what I'd say is, let's remember that London is a great global city, and we're blessed by the fact that we've got this city which is a gateway to the global market, which is what television increasingly is. And it's very easy to get to London from anywhere in the UK. It's not the case if we relocate a channel to somewhere else, and that is a fact of geography.
Stuart, if your dream were to come true, who would you choose?
Jenny, that's not my dream.
Manchester.
Fantasy, pipe dream. I think pipe dream is the word you're
This is a professional argument. It's certainly not my dream.
All
My
right,
dreams-
all
my
right,
dreams
all
are
right. On the
far
basis
too
of your
vain to mention at this
professional
time of the day.
argument,
Pipe
which
dream.
city would you choose? Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow?
I think there's a very strong argument for BBC Two being located in Manchester. I think there's an equally strong argument for CBBC and CBeebies being based in Glasgow, where 20% of children's production is currently done in the UK. I mean, they are views just observed from the point of view of the sectors that currently exist in those cities. But you know, there's no logical answer to say that the concentration of power within an industry has to be in one city. There's a lot of evidence in places like law, the financial services sector, and all of that, which are much more broadly distributed across the UK. And I think that broadcasting, you know, really has to begin to look at the way in which it's evolved historically and say, is that right for a new modern Britain?
And you're biased, obviously, towards Manchester because you're here already, Alice, but looking at it dispassionately, where would you put it?
I'm very biased because I am biased towards Manchester because we've got a creative hub here already. But I actually think you asked me a question about what difference does it make to the viewers and listeners, and I think there's a very serious point here. Probably 20 years ago, we were asking exactly the same question about accents and people of different races being on the television, and actually I think it's part of the same thing. I think we do, at some level, all deserve representation, and we all deserve some form of power. So I would actually raise a cheer if it was based in other place other than London, even though I love London.
But then you're talking about, you know, you don't represent the North from Manchester. Manchester is very different from Leeds, is very different from Newcastle, is very different from Birmingham, is certainly very different from Glasgow. You can't have just one.
Well, this is the point I would make. London is where Britain comes together, and many people who from every region are represented there. I actually think, in a strange way, the rest of Britain would be less represented from Manchester, which is, whatever way you look at it, a provincial city with its own very narrow outlook. Whereas London, I think, is where Britain comes together and Britain meets the rest of the world.
Hang on, Alice.
Yeah,
London
one
is where
final
Britain
thought.
comes together.
I'm a great fan of London, lived there for a long time, and I think there's actually a valid point to be made. But I would put the counter argument, and the counter argument is this: you're putting, you know, all those old cliches, all your eggs in one basket. There is no need for this to be either or; it's and both. If you look at America, the film industry is based in LA, but there is a very nice offshoot in New York where a lot of the creative industry is based. And I think when we're looking at our own cities, you could almost say New York is a provincial city compared to California. You know,
Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't see it as much in representational terms as you're suggesting. I mean, even if a station, for example, that was, a station that was focused on American output, were that based in Manchester, it would bring quite a lot of added value to job creation in the creative industries in Manchester. So it's not just about whether it does or doesn't represent the North. I think that's actually a separate debate. It's an important one, and nonetheless one that you would get into. But I think that you can have a channel, as you've said, QVC. There's all sorts of different channels that can be relocated outside of London.
Stuart Cosgrove, Alice Morrison and Rob Brown for the moment. Thank you all very much indeed. This is The Message on BBC Radio 4. It's 14 minutes to 5. Don't forget, if you want to send us your views, and I'm sure after that discussion you will, email us on the website. It's bbc.co.uk/radio4/factual/The Message, Manchester Provincial indeed. Tut tut. Now, if you're the kind of person who's still awake and listening to the radio after midnight, you may have come across the schlock jocks. They get huge audiences, and the subject matter is frequently sex.
I blamed myself for the abuse, and it's just trying to convince myself it wasn't my fault. It was this man's fault.
Well, obviously, that's what you should be thinking. You should be believing, and you've picked that up from the various groups that you've been in, the counselling.
We've got there at last.
Yeah.
I don't mean to laugh. She's moved in with another bloke. Can I speak now? The fact is that you and she both lied, both cheated, and both pulled the wool over her husband's eyes to get what you both wanted. But essentially, you were as bad as each other. True or false?
Yeah, I would say it's true.
Right.
I mean,
The fact is, you two never, ever could trust each other because of the way you got together. And lo and bloody behold, we've gone full circle, and guess what? She's doing exactly the same to you as you and she did to her husband.
Right, you're listening to Scotty McClue. We are, of course, live on the country's top radio station. This is Magic. This is the Massive Magic Megaphone in. Do you like the Home Secretary's Sexual Offences Bill, which will actually legalise gay sex in public toilets as long as gays are behind a locked cubicle door? I certainly don't want anything to do with cubicles where there's been a couple of gay men giving it the 1-2 buckle my shoe, but tell us what you think, of course.
Well, you heard Mark Forrest of Century in London, Jezza on Virgin, that's nationwide, and Scotty McClue, who's based in Sheffield but goes out across Lincolnshire and the North East. But are these presenters qualified to impose their opinions on the listeners or give them advice? And might there come a time when a vulnerable caller tips over the edge in the middle of the night without any professional support? Well, Rob Brown stays with us. Scotty McClue is here in Manchester too, and Francis Brown, Programme Director for Heart FM, is in London. There does, Francis, seem to have been a bit of a proliferation of this late-at-night sex recently. What's going on? Is an audience being exploited?
There's always been, certainly for the last 15, 20 years in commercial radio, there have been phone-ins. The majority of them have tended to be very much open forum, reflecting the communities they serve. So the presenter will sit there, who's clearly not qualified in every subject under the sun, and will say, "What's on your mind? Give me a call." And on occasion, those will be about...
And at 1 o'clock in the morning, it's frequently sex, I suppose.
It can be about sex, yes. And I think the question really is whether the listener understands the context, whether the listener understands whether they're calling an experienced, qualified professional or whether they're calling somebody who is there for a chat, somebody who is there to kind of lean on the garden fence and talk about things like you would with a neighbour.
Now, Rob, you've heard some of the output. How did you respond to it?
Well, it's the sort of stuff you pick up when you're driving up the M6 late at night. You tune in and it's... Well, to be honest, I did end up lingering on it, but I'd say it was the fascination of the grotesque, really. What you get is what sound like very sad people. They seem to be insomniacs, if they're not driving on the motorway, of course. And they give us the most personal insights into their lives. But what really gets me is that these people, clearly, who are chairing the programmes, comparing them, aren't qualified in any way to deal with that sort of problem. There is no support network as you would get, for example, even on the Jerry Springer show. This is live, it's early in the morning. These people don't know that the person phoning them doesn't have a bottle of tablets beside them when they're spilling their hearts out.
What sort of questions and issues have you had to handle, Scotty?
Well, I think all these things, what Rob's saying, all these things are absolutely possible. And therefore it's up to the presenter to make sure that the people are in safe hands. And by safe hands, I think what you've then got to do is if somebody will quite often, you've got to know your audience, you've got to get to know your audience, and that's what I've been doing over the last 12 years. And sometimes somebody will ring and they'll say, I don't like you, this is a dreadful programme, I'm not going to listen again. And you say, yeah, that's great. Macquarie. What's wrong? Oh, nothing. I'm absolutely... No, there's something wrong.
But Stuart, don't give us this phony intimacy now. That's what you do on air.
Yes.
You don't know your audience. How can you know your audience? If someone phones you out of the blue with some deeply distressing personal problem, and you're claiming to know them.
Well, you're
giving them a safe pair of hands.
From them. Yes, you're a safe pair of hands. Well, the safe pair of hands. Yes, we're not medically qualified. We haven't said we're medically qualified. We're not psychiatrically qualified. We haven't said we're psychiatrically qualified. So, on the basic level, you've got one human being talking to another. Now, where's the harm in that? That's not a crime.
But I mean, what Rob described it as was the fascination of the grotesque.
I think that's an insult to the audiences, to be quite honest, because I think people are interested in how other people are feeling at a certain situation in their lives, at a certain time in the day. And I don't think you can call audiences grotesque. These are ordinary people who have everyday problems.
Well, they do, but what they should be doing is calling people who are qualified to deal with it. Now, what you're talking about is a total stranger calling you in the night you've never met with a deeply distressing problem, and you're saying you've got a safe pair of hands. What you're trying to do is drum up a radio audience. And the more grotesque it is, the more sensational, the more fascinating and outrageous it is, the better. What happens to that person afterwards? Well, you really don't care.
But yes, I do, and I think that you'll drum up your radio audience by actually looking after that person, because people
So
will say
what follow-up do you do?
When that person came on, people were very, very concerned about it. When that person went off, they weren't going to take their own life.
How do you know?
I think that's progress, because that's what they've told us.
Hang on, let's bring Francis in here, because you have a managerial role in all of this, Francis. We know that there have been tragedies with some of the US television shows where people have either murdered someone, or I'm sure there have been people who've tried to harm themselves. How concerned are you about vulnerable people maybe being left very high and dry after one of these shows?
Well, on Heart 106.2, for example, we currently run a music show, but when we used to run a phone-in that included sexual and emotional problems, the person we had was Dr. Pam Spur, who's a doctor of psychology. So in that case, we felt we had a good level of expertise on air, and we also had a significant amount of support behind the scenes with a number of production teams and contact numbers and so on.
And why did you think that was important?
In the case of Heart, I felt it was very important that we were seen to be behaving in a responsible way, and we were setting it up specifically as a programme around sexual and emotional content and problems. I think if you're running a more general show where people call you out of the blue, then if you're not pretending to be an expert, I think there is less of an issue.
Why?
Because you have to trust in your audience to understand that they're calling a radio station and talking to a radio presenter.
Isn't that true, Rob, actually, to some extent? That, you know, Scott is there night after night after night. People know what they're getting into.
Well, yeah, I mean, they are familiar with Scotty's act, and that's what it is. It's very much an act. These people are not exceptionally compassionate, well-qualified counsellors. They're people that are good at drumming up what they think is interesting radio. And it can be interesting. As I said earlier on, I found myself listening to it on the motorway or whatever. But what I'm saying is that radio regulators should be stepping in here and saying, if you're going to do that type of programme, well, as with television, you have to make sure that there is a very proper support structure, which will cost money, which commercial radio never likes to spend. And also, there is the problem of something like that going out live. Remember, some of these outrageous television shows that we're all familiar from midday programmes, daytime programmes, they're pre-recorded, and that is a very important fact.
I don't think we're needing any more regulation at all, Rob. I'm sorry, but I really thoroughly disagree with that. In fact, I think we're engaged in something far more noble than you're prepared to admit, and that is public access radio. And that's what I've devoted the last 12 years of my life to. Never mind all this drumming up radio audiences. The radio audiences follow if the product is good enough.
Funny that, the word noble never sprung to my mind when I was listening to what actually goes out. The fact is, you're pretending that you're the new priesthood, if you like. We live in a secular society, and the sad thing is that people have to phone people like you to try and get some advice. Very miserable, very depressed, usually, people. And, yeah, it's fine. It says a lot about the state of our society, but don't use words like noble when you're talking about your
No, I think
please.
it's very noble. In actual fact, I think it's something that the BBC should be looking at as a public service broadcaster. Public access radio. I would like to see radio phone-in programmes taking on a slant like people go into the cash machine. I'll lift up the telephone and ring Scotty on Magic.
And do they send the cash to you while they're doing that?
Francis, is it a public service, or is it... I think this is probably a stupid question, really, to someone who runs a commercial radio station. Is it just a way of getting a big audience?
Honestly, I think it's normally both. As I say, we don't run a phone-in like that on Heart, but I used to present a similar kind of a show in the North East. And certainly as a presenter, very often you were thinking about two things simultaneously. One of them absolutely is this entertaining to listen to? And at the same time, am I actively making a difference to the person who's listening? And on occasion, if things get too difficult, then the presenter can bail out, can go to a break, can carry on the conversation afterwards, put a record on. There are lots of ways that the presenter can manage the situation if it does become difficult.
Well, I think it's dangerous and potentially lethal. And I make one prediction here. If this trend continues, there won't be too long before we pick up a newspaper and hear of some poor soul who has taken their own life or done something equally dreadful as a result of the phony counselling and advice that have been offered by a completely irresponsible commercial radio system in Britain.
Scotty, that really must be of concern to you.
It is of concern to me, of course it's of concern to me, but I can name 12 separate occasions when you could pick up a newspaper, a national broadsheet, a local paper, and they have attributed the fact that somebody has not taken their own life to the fact that they got onto Scotty McClue's phone and he talked them out of it.
But one other point, Scotty, I mean, even if you're not doling out advice, just listening to what you were saying about the homosexuals and public toilets earlier, how proper is it that a presenter expresses what felt to me like obvious homophobic distaste?
It's not homophobia at all. I mean, I was making a very simple point, Jenny, that people use public loos for the purpose that public loo is intended to be used for, and not for having sort of, explicit sex in the cubicles. And I would be very worried if I was a family man and sending perhaps a young son into a public toilet where, homosexuals were cavorting. I mean, you don't see heterosexual couples going on like that, seeking toilets. There's so much equality around. It's certainly not homophobic. I'm just appealing to gay people to, perform in the proper places.
How do you regard the presenter in that kind of role, giving that kind of strong opinion?
Well, I think it's interesting that Stuart, that Scotty mixes his counselling and advice, his tender advice, with this completely outrageous ranting. It depends, of course, how many people he has on the line. If he doesn't have some poor hapless soul who's going to cry on air, then he goes into rant mode, because it's whatever works, whatever fills the airtime. And we're talking early morning here. That's what he does. It's an act. It's kind of multi-layered act, but it's an act.
Well, at that point, I'm afraid we have to end. Rob Brown, Francis Curry, who I think I called Francis Brown earlier, my apologies, and Scotty McClue, thank you all very much indeed for being with us. As usual, there's more information about the guests on the website. You can add your own thoughts to the conversations. If you've just turned on the radio and caught the end of the programme, you can hear the whole show at the click of a mouse. bbc.co.uk/radio4/factual/the message. I'll get that right one day. Bye-bye.